grand scale conceptual approach that I'll be taking. If it gets a little too systematic throughout, just keep this in mind. And this is you can't follow, of course, because it's pretty generic, very obvious. Remember, coordination is what we're looking at. Okay, so now let's talk about problems for coordinating. So I've identified 4. This is just my identification. I'm not saying that in any sense it's exclusive to 4. It might be more than 4, but for me and for the analysis that I've been doing and the reading that I've been doing, I've identified at least 4, and there might be more impediments to interagency coordination. So I'll write it down. 4 impediments, 4 roadblocks to so 4 impediments to interagency coordination, right? The point is, let's begin with the impediments. If we know specifically, and I'm sure there are more, but there's only so much time that I can devote to giving a free lecture, right? But with respect to the interagency coordination, if we know from the jump, from the beginning, what the roadblocks are, then what we do is we react to those perceived roadblocks. This might be a problem. Okay, let's design our policies, let's design our information sharing environment such that that no longer becomes a problem. So let's see what the problems are, map those out, and then we adjust accordingly. That's the approach. Okay, so the first, in no particular order, separate statutory missions, right? Separate statutory missions. We do different things, right? We've already seen, and this is just an example through the discourse, that the relationship between the local law enforcement and the SLTT, state, local, territorial, and tribal, that their function differs. Same objective, same overall framework. Anti-terrorism, counterterrorism, coordination of information, but it's different than specifically, let's look at what I'm identifying as regional clearinghouse functions, the JTTF, and this might be a little, you will have had to have watched the videos up until this point, because I am talking a little jargon, quick filled. So I'm going to assume that if you're watching the videos, you're not starting your viewing now, because now we're deep in it, right? So it's going to be pretty heavy jargon, right? Because we're like 5-6 hours into the lecture now. Okay, so we recognize that the function of what I'm classifying the LLE, local law enforcement, the LLE and the SLTT is different from the JTTF and the Department of Homeland Security fusion centers. We see that the mission, what they're charged with, the DHSFC, Department of Homeland Security Fusion Center, is different from the JTTF. 2 totally different missions. One mission, the mission of, generally speaking, right? The mission, generally speaking, of the Fusion Center is analysis of data, right? Let's break it down. Let's make sense of it. Let's analyze the data. This is intel. This is where the hub, right? This is where we're making sense of the intelligence that we've gathered. Okay, great. That intelligence we've seen routes its way throughout the intelligence infrastructure. Once it gets back to the JTTF, now they're charged with, right, their mission is different. Their mission is, okay, based on the intel that we've gotten and the go-aheads and the green lights that we've gotten from all the bureaucrats that have the power, we now are going to start conducting investigations and start arrests. Conducting investigations and processing and analyzing intelligence, they both serve the same overarching, and I'll address this in a second, they both serve the same overarching objective. However, the missions are different. The fact that the mission of the charge, the vision, if you will, in a very general sense, of the agencies differ, make interaction, interagency cooperation a bit difficult. Because the point is, listen, I work for imagine, I work for the JTTF, and you work for a fusion center. You're an analyst. You analyze data all day. You make sense of all of that stuff. That's not what I do, right? I go out and I get the bad guys, right? So in a sense, it's how can it's 2 totally different. And I'm being facetious, right? You have to think of it in a negative sense because we're trying to say that this is a roadblock, right? In a sense, you don't really what you do affects me, but you don't understand what it is that I do. I have to then take that, make sure I'm working with local law enforcement, coordinate a whole bunch of local law enforcement, be able to get the proper subpoenas and warrants and move in with local law enforcement to target guys and pull them and arrest them and deport them and blah, 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 blah. That's in no way, in no sense, the same as sort of analyzing data, right? So you get the overarching dilemma here, right? So the idea is we have the objective, and the objective is the same. However, the difficulty comes in the function. The functions differ, right? I, in the JTTF, am charged with function 1, sort of, seize and arrest. You, in the DHSFC, you're charged with function 2, and that's sort of processing. My function and your function are interrelated insofar as I need your information in order to do my job, but they're two totally different positions. And if you want to look at it in a pessimistic sense as a roadblock, we have separate statutory missions, right? What we do is not the same. We don't have the same function, right? And this is why I put function, right? The function that we provide, yes, we have the same objective, decrease the likelihood of terrorist attack in the United States of America. However, the mechanisms, and I'll talk about mechanisms later, but the mechanisms in which we go about satisfying the objective functionally is different. What you need to recognize then, since we now recognize this, is that what we need to do, if we're properly going to be talking about interagency coordination, is to create a uniform functionality. We have to find functional mechanisms, and I'll talk about this specifically, within and among all of the departments that allow them to cooperate, right? We need to find out functionally what they can do and what arises so that they can cooperate interagency, interdepartmentally. So that's the overarching goal, right? So we see that the missions are different, and that makes sense. So here's a pretty interesting quote that I found to, again, support this. This is not just me cooking this up myself. Quote, "But the more fundamental impediments to cooperative interagency and intergovernmental management of major disasters will not be so easy to resolve," right? There's going to be difficulties, right? This is not because these problems are rooted in divergent sources of constitutional authority. That is because these problems are rooted in divergent sources of constitutional authority. So there's different constitutional authority that various agencies have, in divergent statutory missions, which I just described, and administrative means, and thus in divergent organizational cultures, right? So cultures differ. All right, so the second is administrative barriers, right? I'm not going to get into the basically bureaucracy. The only people that would have a full understanding of the administrative barriers would be people in the government. I'm not in the government, so I wouldn't really know what this is, but just in academia, you think it would be easy as a professor to have a new class. So I'm a genocide scholar. My main interest is mass murder on a huge scale. So I want to introduce a class on, mass murder. Right? I want to have a mass murder class. You think it would be simple. Okay, I want to have a mass murder class. I'm going to, talk to my chair, talk to the dean, and now I have my class. It's not that easy, right? In order to actually get the class that I want to teach, there's a lot of ropes that I have to go through. Of course, I'm not going to discuss that here. Then there might be barriers in me attempting to get that class. They might say, oh, well, mass murder, there's another department, criminal justice has a mass murder class, and it's going to overlap with your class, so you can't do it, so maybe you can blah, 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 right? Administrative barriers. One impediment to interagency coordination is administrative barriers. And the key administrative barrier is going to be overlap, right? Function, remember we talked about the function of the agency or the mission. If there's functional overlap, there's going to be problems. In this new 21st century refinement, if you will, of the intelligence infrastructure, and not just the intelligence infrastructure, but DHS as a whole, what I would say is absolutely necessary is that we eliminate all the functional overlap between departments. And I'll